Alright, welcome to another tutorial. In this tutorial I'm going to show you how to create a basic React app. What you are seeing right now is this is a terminal open for one of my droplets in DigitalOcean. So one of my basically virtual machines, and I'm SSH'd into it, and I have created a React directory. I have a lot of React directories, but in this particular one I created one specifically for this tutorial, and we're just going to cd into React 8 because I already installed everything. Created a new React restall. If you don't know how to create a React app, all you have to do is put npx create React app, and I just did rct8. But I already created it and I'm already inside. What I want to do at this moment is I want to create a .env file, so I'm going to do a vim.env. The reason why I want to do that is because I want to change the port number. So the port number typically is 3000. I want to change it to 4000 because I already have something on 3000. So I did that. Oops, let me lowercase this and put colon wq to save and quit. And now I want to put npm start. So at this moment you see my IP address and the port number 4000, and you already got this message, site can't be reached. But once I hit npm start and it loads up the development server, everything should be going according to plan. I think I should remove some of these things, and I'm actually on Atom. In addition to that, I am using my FTP. I'm using FTP for WinSCP in order to change or edit files. Let me reload this. Alright, and go back into here, go into sources, and also go into app.js because that is the basic file you need to do all the editing. So first off, let's just say, what is React Redux? So typically with React, you have so many different components, and if you need to use a certain value or a certain property within a state, and there is certain components that are that have multiple layers, or they are components, maybe there's a component that's a grandchild of this component, and you need to get this specific property or this specific set of data, you have to usually, or originally you would have to pass the value down from component to component to component. So with React Redux, what you were supposed to do, or what it's supposed to do, is to make a global state. So you have several different properties in this global state, and now you don't have to pass the value down from component to component to component. What you can do is pretty much just grab it with map state to props. But in this particular example, we're going to use hooks, and we're going to actually use two different hooks. One is going to be called useSelector to grab the global state, and use dispatch to dispatch an action that will change the property of a state. But yeah, to make a long story short, you have a global state, and now you don't have to do prop drilling. That's the technical term. Is it a technical term? It's the term to use when you're passing value downs from component to component that are nested within each other. And let's actually look into here. Okay, so it's running and it's at port 4000. Let's look, and it's working. So just to prove that this is the exact component that we see here, I'm just going to put hello world and see what happens. So I save it, should reload, and bam, hello world. Fantastic. So what I want to do now, well, I'm going to just remove this SVG because I know they're always going to complain about, oh, you're not using a logo. So let's save that. In addition to that, let's also get outside of this, or exit out here, and actually install React and React Redux. So I'm going to put npm I for npm install, and I'm going to put React Redux, and I'm going to put Redux, and I'll put -d in order to save it as a dev dependency. While all those things are loading, let's now create another component, and we're going to call this counter. Within this basic setup of React Redux, I'm just going to create a counter component, and it's basically going to have two buttons, one to increment a component, one to increment the counter or the state property, and one to decrement it. It's pretty simple. This is a pretty simple basic structure that most React Redux applications have, but yeah, this is just a show or how to do it. So now we have the counter.js opened up. We are going to grab some of this code that I already created, and pretty much maybe let's go here first. Let's go to app.js and actually first grab all the import statements that we need, which in here is create, store, and provider. So in order to create this global state, we have to wrap it around this component called provider, and within provider we have this attribute called store. And within the store, you're supposed to have the actual reducer to be stored in the store. So then, within multiple components, they'll be able to access the state. Okay. So let's just first put in provider, right? And we're going to do this. And we're also going to put the attribute of store, and we're going to create store eventually. So we got this. We're going to wrap this around provider. So now any component that is within the provider component should be able to gain access to the global state and gain access to any type of value that is going to be within that global state. Now we want to talk about the initial state. So we're going to put const init state. And in here we're going to have an object literal, and it's only going to have one property, and it's going to be called counter, and it's going to have the going to have the value of 0. Fantastic. And now we're going to talk about the reducer a little bit. And with the reducer, there's supposed to be only two parameters within the reducer, and that is the state, which we're going to have the default be assigned to this default of initial state, and the action. Let's talk a little bit about reducer. So the reducer is pretty much like the controller of the state, and it's really dependent upon what action type is being returned when it's being dispatched. When you think of dispatch, think of a signal firing off to the reducer, and it's carrying valuable data or valuable message that can give it a clue as to what they need to do to update the state. And again, the state has all the properties of values. In this particular example, we're going to just try to figure out how we're going to update or change the counter value. So you can have the action be in if statements, or the action be in switch statements. I prefer switch statements because typically you're going to have more than just one case, as opposed to like if else if things. So every action should have a type, and an action can also have a payload, but it should always have a type. And within that type, you'll have different cases that should have an explanation of what's happening. For example, within the counter that we're going to use, there's going to be two buttons. There's going to have a button to increment things and a button to decrease things. So when I click on the button, it should have an action that expresses what the action is. So within this, I'm just going to have something simple that says increment. Typically when you have an action type, you try to put it uppercase, but in this simple example, I'm just going to put it as lowercase. In addition to that, you also want to return a new state. So instead of, for example, instead of just doing like return state dot counter and putting plus plus, what you want to do is return a new object literal and put the counter and put counter plus 1. And within here, with decrement, we're just going to minus it. Matter of fact, let's just grab this and copy this over here and do that and put minus instead of plus. Great. So we pretty much got the reducer up, which controls how the state will update its properties. And in this particular example, there's only two cases: one to increase the counter and one to decrease the counter. Now, the final thing we have to do is to create the store. So we're going to create another constant variable, and we're going to call this store, and we are going to call the create store. Create store can hold two values. The first parameter is going to be the reducer, and the second parameter will be apply middleware. We're not going to get into all that stuff at this moment, so let's just focus on reducer. And then now that we created a store, it should hold the reducer and ultimately hold the global properties or the variables that you can use and pass it off to anything. So we're going to put store and store. Let's also look into here and see if React Redux, okay, the packages have been installed. Fantastic. Now let's go to npm start in order to run the application again. And while we're doing all that, I want to import counter. Okay, so we're going to import counter, and I think, oh yeah, well, I haven't actually added anything into counter.js yet, but we're going to make it a default value, so we can just do, import it like that instead of wrap it around curly braces and then just put counter and this. So everything should work. Let's actually put the counter inside the application and just save it. I'm probably going to get an error message because nothing is inside here, but that's completely fine. So let's actually go in here and just grab all this and put this into counter. So let's save this, and while we're saving this, let's see what happens. Counter is not defined. Counter is not defined. Counter is not defined. What are you talking about? Oh, I'm supposed to put state.counter. I'm sorry, because since it's object literal, we're calling state, and I have state.counter, so we put state.counter here. Yes, sir. Great. So this should save it, and line 22-7. Ooh, it should be return state. I think that's the problem. Yes, it is. Okay, but let's go back to counter. So like I was saying earlier, there's just going to be, well, you could probably look at it right now if I reload the page here. Like I said, there will be two buttons, one for plus and one for minus, and just a header that says counter and the default value of counter, which we see at app.js. It was 0, but as you can see right now, if I change it to 6, it will be 6. The default value will be 6. So what's going on in counter.js? So we're actually grabbing two hooks from React Redux called use dispatch and use selector. So let's talk about use dispatch. Use dispatch is pretty much dispatch, and dispatch is just sending out or returning the action that will either have a type in the payload, or just a type payload and any other property that you would like to add. Within this example, I'm just going to return a type, and then I'm going to do all the coding or changing of the property within the case statement, as opposed to retrieving a payload. And so dispatch is supposed to signal or return the action type, and when you click on this button on an on-click button, I have created a function called handle click that returns the action or the string, and then I click dispatch, or it calls dispatch, which will have the type of the action. So if I click if I click the plus button, it's going to return increment, which then goes into the reducer, and then with a switch statement, once the increment matches up with action type, it will return a new property of a new state that will have the counter, state counter, plus 1. In the same way with decrement, it will just minus it. With useSelector, what it does, it grabs the global state of counter and then assigns it to counter and puts it into the input. So that's why when I change the default value from 0 to 6, it automatically updated 6. We can do that one more time just to show you what's going on. And we save it like this, and bam, it's now 10. Now everything is working properly. I've done this several times. So once I hit increment, the increment button or the plus button, it should update. And if I hit this or the minus button, it should decrease even into the negatives. Well, okay, see, so it is working. So this is pretty much the basic setup of how you create React app. I think I'm going to have a link that have a step-by-step instructions of how to just create a basic setup with React Redux and put on my GitHub repository. So if anybody wants to learn how to do that, they can. Other than that, everybody have a good day, and yeah.